In other wars, captured Americans, subjected to the hell of an enemy prison, were considered heroes. In other wars, they were not abandoned. In Vietnam, they were betrayed. My name is Carlton Sherwood, and I'm a journalist. As an investigative reporter, I've written about corruption in government, corporations, and the military. I've helped to expose doctors who are actually ordering the starvation of handicapped infants, and charlatans who preach faith from the pulpit, but who practice greed and deception in their personal lives. In every case, the guilty parties dishonored their professions and were made to answer for the hurt they caused. Tonight's report is cut from the same cloth. Only for me, it's a lot more personal.
4-3, how do you read? This is 4-3, read you 5.
It's about a war I fought in and what I saw happening when I got back from it. It's about a treachery that was, in its own way, as frightening as the hand-to-hand combat I experienced as a young Marine. It is about what I felt when I first saw and heard this.
We are more guilty than any other body of violations of those Geneva Conventions in the use of free fire zones, harassment interdiction fire, search and destroy missions, the bombings, the torture of prisoners, the killing of prisoners, accepted policy by many units in South Vietnam.
Wait a second, I asked myself. Did I hear that right? Was I, or my fellow Marines, being accused of the same atrocities John Kerry had committed? Later in his testimony, he claimed American soldiers in Vietnam were guilty of even more heinous acts of barbarism.
They had personally raped, cut off ears, cut off heads, taped wires from portable telephones to human genitals and turned up the power, cut off limbs, blown up bodies, randomly shot at civilians, razed villages in a fashion reminiscent of Genghis Khan, shot cattle and dogs for fun, poisoned food stocks, and generally ravaged the countryside of South Vietnam.
As I heard John Kerry speak, I could feel an inner hurt no surgeon's scalpel could remove. I felt the honor of fighting for my country decomposing, just as surely as if all the battle ribbons had been stripped from my chest, leaving only torn patches where once the dignity of sacrifice had been. Yet if the words I heard dishonored the dead and the wounded, what must they have meant to my comrades still in battle? Or even worse, to those imprisoned in the torture chambers of the enemy? It is to the American prisoner of war in Vietnam this report is dedicated, and it is from their lips that the bitter truth will long last be heard. The decade-long war in Vietnam was the longest America ever fought, and the only foreign war America never won. Not that we didn't try. At its height, 540,000 American troops went to battle. More than 58,000 were killed and over 300,000 wounded. Twice as many bombs were dropped on the enemy than the combined United States-British bombing of Germany in World War II. The price paid in Treasury exceeded $150 billion. The price exacted from the national spirit is still being paid today. In a cause lost more at home than on the battlefield, the reason for containing communism, first enunciated by President Truman and later implemented by Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, was undermined by voices at home that screamed protest and urged withdrawal. The only monuments to this war will be the dead, the maimed, the despairing, and the forlorn, one anonymous source is quoted as saying. This despondency not only divided our citizens, but encouraged our enemies to inflict even greater atrocities on American prisoners of war. People like Kenneth Cordier, John Jack Fellows, Ralph Gaither, Paul Galante, Carlisle Smitty Harris, Gordon Swede Larson, Thomas McNish, Robinson Reisner, Jack Van Loan, James Warner, Ronald Webb, Leo Thorsness, recipient of the Medal of Honor. What was home to many prisoners over 30 years ago was this place, a prison built by the French before they were run out of the country by the Vietnamese. Our prisoners called it the Hanoi Hilton. No one ever dared to call room service, since a knock on the door usually meant a beating or a sadistic interrogation. The cells were dank, barren, and shuttered from the sunlight. Communication between them was accomplished by a tap code the prisoners invented. But mostly the cells were sullen places with a foreboding silence broken often by screams of pain. And there was plenty of that to go around.
They'd bend you over double and pass a rope around your body and then jump up and down your back, pulling that rope tighter and tighter and tighter, cutting off all your circulation. And after a short time, it became extremely painful. And they had other types where they'd have U-bolts. They'd run a bar through your legs and put the weight of a heavy bar through these U-bolts through your ankles, and the weight of it would cut off circulation and create intense pain. The rope was the worst. It had lasting effects sometimes. They'd tie your arms up with the rope so tight. A couple times they would cross my elbows behind my back, cut off circulation, and sometimes be days before you get feeling back in your hands. Everyone reached a point you had to bend to their will. You just couldn't take it anymore.
Oh, they great torture to extract the confession out of you. I spent 14 hours in a rope trick. And when I came out, I couldn't move my arms. And they wanted me to write. I can't write, I can't move. And I spent the next 6 months or so getting the arms back. I couldn't move from the shoulders down. And they wanted a confession. They wanted me to confess my crimes against the people. And this was going on all the time.
Interestingly enough, when they got through torturing you enough that you would, under duress, write something or do whatever they were after, the last thing they always asked for was demanded, that you write a statement saying, I have been well treated by the lenient and humane people of the Democratic Republic of North Vietnam. This was after they tortured you to get whatever else they wanted.
I was told by them the penalty was death, execution, and I was threatened. One time, I'll never forget it, where they said, unless you confess your crimes, tomorrow morning you'll be executed. Tomorrow morning came and I heard some guards march out. Obviously the execution didn't come, but it gives you pause for thought.
They had a standard torture technique that was used on almost everyone. And that was to put your hands in manacles, not handcuffs, manacles, which are clamps that you can't move, behind you, behind your back, and then put ropes around your upper arms and tighten up on them until the elbows touch. And then they just go away and leave you until you screamed loud enough and long enough, and they'd come in, loosen the ropes, and resume the interrogations. The first time that happened to me, they released the bonds and continued the interrogation. I started giving them some answers, which they quickly deduced were largely false. And so they put me back in the ropes, and as they were tying me up again, I yelled at the interrogator. I was still pretty brave at this point. I said, "You're barbarians. You're torturing me, and I'm injured. I need to see a doctor, not be tortured." "Oh, what is wrong with you?" And I said, "My back is broken. I'm in a lot of pain." Well, that was a big mistake because in addition to being put in the ropes, they hog-tied me, put a rope around my neck and my ankles and arched my back backwards. And then I found out later that this was also standard treatment. Every guy that had an injury, they tortured the injury to break him more quickly. A broken arm would be twisted behind his back, or a broken leg, put him in a chair and twist the leg behind him. That was standard treatment. Very pragmatic. It made the guy break quicker.
Those who resisted torture to the point where they lost control of their mental faculties, became totally psychologically separated from reality, developed extreme phases of psychosis. The Vietnamese would just allow them to starve themselves to death rather than keeping them as everlasting mementos of their inhumanity.
And dozens of Americans were killed in captivity, though the true number may never be known. If such brutality was not severe enough on the average day, it was even worse when Jane Fonda, Tom Hayden, and other anti-war activists came to visit. The Vietnamese wanted to exploit their condemnation of America, and our prisoners were expected to be a responsive audience. They were ordered to behave, if not applaud, and were guaranteed the best seats in the house for every performance.
Jane Fonda, in turn, when she came there, made tapes that were played in our cells. I never saw her face to face, but she made tapes that indicated that we were criminals and that any punishment we were receiving from the North Vietnamese was legitimate and we deserved it, and that we should be punished. One of our biggest problems, hang-ups, was how in the world could our government allow these people to come over there without a visa, without authorization, against the law, visit a country that we're fighting and give aid and comfort to them while we're sitting there languishing in those prison cells. It's hard to fathom. They drew a circle on the floor, stone floor with a piece of chalk, and I was to stand in that circle. And I lasted 97 hours in that circle, but when I finally gave it up, I, of course, got into it with a guard, and I got beaten up pretty bad after that, broke some teeth. But while I was in that circle, I was able to see the front gate, and I saw Tom Hayden enter the camp, and I saw Mary McCarthy enter the camp. And of course, they were hyped at that time as being visitors to North Vietnam, and never met them face to face, but I was allowed to see this activity coming through the gate of the camp, I guess to influence me that Americans were obviously opposed to the war, and that I ought to be also.
I was in pain a lot of the time. I was being treated inhumanely. It was difficult for me when although the Vietnamese tried to get us to believe, and I know that we had more than one person come to Vietnam who was, the Vietnamese told me that these people said they were winning the war in the streets of America. I certainly didn't approve of that. I didn't think it was right for an American to come over and bolster the Vietnamese morale.
In the case of Jim Stockdale, Admiral Stockdale, they wanted him to meet a delegation. And he came up with the idea of blackening his own eye to keep from meeting that delegation. He picked up a stool and smashed that stool in his face twice to blacken his eyes so that he wouldn't have to meet that delegation. And as a result, he was severely tortured and didn't meet the delegation, but he went through hell for his actions.
American prisoners of war, like any other Americans, were, if nothing else, ingenious. They found ways in the most dire of circumstances to confound the enemy and knock his best-laid deceptions off stride. As when Admiral Jeremiah Denton blinked the word torture in Morse code while being forced to make a false confession by his captors.
I happened to have found out about a tap code that was used in World War II, and I shared it with the other guys, and because that was so early on, we were all the early shoot downs, that when we got back to our cells and we're back in solitary confinement, we immediately started using that tap code, and it had not been taught to everyone, and it was the code that we used from then on out through our incarceration to communicate between cells. For a long time, you know, they heard it and I guess didn't pay much attention to it, and they finally realized that we really were being able to communicate, and in some places they demanded absolute silence, but we just found other ways to communicate by flashing a hand or a piece of paper under a crack that someone could read across the way, or to use coughs and sneezes and hacks and for 1 through 5, and we just found more secure ways that they could not identify as tapping to communicate. They never shut us down.
Little did the American prisoners of war imagine that halfway around the world, events were conspiring to make their precarious situation even more desperate. That an American naval lieutenant, after a 4-month tour of duty in Vietnam, was meeting secretly in an undisclosed location in Paris with a top enemy diplomat. That this same lieutenant had joined forces with Jane Fonda's anti-war efforts and was the spokesman for the so-called Vietnam Veterans Against the War, many of whom would later be discovered as frauds, men who had never set foot on the battlefield or left the comfort of the States, or even served in uniform, except in mock contempt of the military. Their lurid fantasies of butchery in Vietnam were seized upon by John Kerry to help him organize the so-called Winter Soldiers investigation, the template he would use to brand all Vietnam veterans.
Is there something that you really kind of want to say in terms of the crimes and why they happened? What brings you here? What makes you say, I want to testify, I want to say something?
I'd almost need a book to answer that now. It's like just so many things bothered me about just that short period that I was over there.
Never mind, many of the horror stories seem made up on the spot.
You might be able to come up with that. I was trying to find somebody that knew something about a bill wiped out in Quang Tri.
Right, I was there.
You got that?
Because that was, we went into the area, and it was to set the example to show that we weren't f***ing around. So the first thing we do was burn down the village and kill everybody. Okay, whenever they're questioning me, they'll have to get me to elaborate on that, because I don't. I forgot all about that one.
How could you forget that? I remembered it and I wasn't even in on it.
This was the, quote, evidence John Kerry would swear to before the U.S. Senate. Testimony that would quickly travel halfway around the world to convince our prisoners that back home they stood accused and abandoned.
The country doesn't know it yet, but it's created a monster. A monster in the form of millions of men who have been taught to deal and to trade in violence, and who are given the chance to die for the biggest nothing in history. Men who have returned with a sense of anger and a sense of betrayal which no one has yet grasped. And we cannot consider ourselves America's best men when we were ashamed of and hated what we were called on to do in Southeast Asia.
Enemy propagandists had found a new and willing accomplice, and for some prisoners, the consequences were swift and deeply personal.
The interrogator showed me a transcript of testimony that my mother had given at something called the Winter Soldier hearings. I read her testimony, and it wasn't damning, but then I saw some of the other stuff that had gone on at this Winter Soldier hearing. I wondered, how did somebody get my mother persuaded to come appear at something like this? And then shortly thereafter, he showed me some statements from John Kerry. I know that he did talk to her, and he talked to my sisters. And I really don't know what was in their minds to participate in this, but I do know this, and that is, you know, it is really a contemptible act to take a grieving old lady and prey upon her grief and manipulate her grief purely for the promotion of your own political agenda.
If the Kerry accusations weren't disturbing enough, the timing of them raises even more serious questions about the motive and character of the accuser. In 1971, when Kerry delivered his Stop the Killing, End the War manifesto, the war had all but ended. Less than half of our army remained in Vietnam. A year later, they too would be gone. Yet to the average American combatant, having been branded by Kerry as a demon and a murderer, getting out of Vietnam alive was a high-risk adventure. But in 1971, there were also 700 prisoners still being held in Hanoi, mostly American pilots, now pawns in a deadly international game of face-saving. Their lives hung by a thread, their fate entirely in the hands of a pitiless enemy who had shown no compunction about inflicting pain, torture, and death on their defenseless captives. Now their nightly tap codes on prison cell walls not only spoke of reprisals from a ruthless enemy, but the new peril that threatened their chances of ever returning home again. The damning words of an American naval lieutenant they once called their own.
The interrogator went through all of these statements from John Kerry, and he starts pounding on the table. See, here, this naval officer, he admits that you are a criminal and that you deserve punishment. Well, look, they told us this is a camp for punishment. We're in solitary confinement. When a guy starts pounding the table, and you can spot this in them when they start, their voice starts to rise, their face gets red, that's usually a sign that something bad is about to happen.
The things he said were just devastating because he was talking about using the words like war criminal and that kind of stuff. As a prisoner of war, we were being told we're war criminals and that we'll be tried for war crimes, and unless we confess and ask for forgiveness and badmouth the war and take their side in the war, we'll never go home. I mean, you talk, and then here's a guy at home. He's been in Vietnam, so yeah, I have some respect for the person who went over there. And now he swaps to the other side, and he's saying the same things we're being tortured to say. That was a very difficult time.
Well, my reaction to the Kerry testimony, the perjurous testimony in front of that Senate hearing committee in April of '71, I was outraged, and still am, that he willingly said things which were untrue, the very same points that we took torture not to write and say. They tortured us and made us write a war crimes confession to be used later, where we confessed to committing war crimes, and that we condemned our government's policy for being in Vietnam, and that we asked their forgiveness. And it was gall in my mouth to write these words, but I couldn't take any more of the torture. And for someone to do that willingly, and for someone to pass himself off as representing all veterans in Vietnam and saying these outrageous things that were totally untrue, it just, to me, it's the measure of the man.
Every military combat guy I've talked to from Vietnam said their greatest fear was not being killed, was becoming a POW. And as you know, there are people captured in South Vietnam who were literally skinned alive and so on. It was most brutal. And Kerry's giving the captors ammunition to treat people like that if they're captured. And these are people he knew. Where in the world is his loyalty to the people in the military?
But what about the allegations themselves? How true were they? How many were out-and-out fabrication, lies, designed to shock America, throw one last spotlight on the waning anti-war movement? And how many were driven by one man's personal political ambitions?
When he came back and told those lies about these atrocities that he'd personally witnessed, and the ears being cut off, he never saw anybody's ears get cut off. He knew, or he should have known, those guys he was with were frauds. They were just outright frauds.
To say that we were rapists, we were murderers, we were pillagers is absolutely a lie. There's just no two ways about it.
As to whether I believed that Kerry had actually seen these things, no. We understand something happened at My Lai. Frankly, I certainly, if you had told me the Marines had done this, I wouldn't believe it, because I can't comprehend that we would have let an officer get away with something like that. But that's beside the point. The My Lai massacre happened, but the guy, Calley, was punished for it. These things did not go on all the time.
Yes, all America cringed 2 years earlier in 1969 when Lieutenant Calley's actions at the massacre of My Lai hit the front pages. But wasn't this an isolated incident? Were not the cruelties of My Lai exposed by the soldiers there? American soldiers who refused to participate, whose revulsion compelled them to tell of the horrors they had witnessed. Was not John Kerry taking the exception and making it the rule? More than that, wasn't he saying that Americans, by their nature, were a murderous horde, unrestrained by accepted rules of combat or even the most basic forms of human decency?
We rationalized destroying villages in order to save them. We saw America lose her sense of morality as she accepted very coolly a My Lai and refused to give up the image of American soldiers that hand out chocolate bars and chewing gum. We learned the meaning of free fire zones, shoot anything that moves, and we watched while America placed a cheapness on the lives of Orientals.
Intended or not, Lieutenant Kerry painted a depraved portrait of Vietnam veterans, literally creating the image of those who served in combat as deranged, drug-addicted psychopaths, baby killers. And that odious image has endured in the press and popular culture for more than 30 years. Nearly every book or motion picture produced about Vietnam since 1971 echoes the litany of atrocities John Kerry laid at the feet of men who served there, especially those in frontline battle positions who bore the brunt of suffering and death. It was his evil American soldier on a bloody rampage that filled the screens and lined the pockets of producers of films like Apocalypse Now, Platoon, and Casualties of War. He wrote the first draft of history, not of Vietnam, but of those who fought there, and his was a history of shame and cruelty, dishonor, and unspeakable barbarity. But was it the truth? Or were all Vietnam veterans slandered, their honor stolen?
All of the contacts that I've had with veterans from South Vietnam have straight out said that that did not happen. Those were point-blank lies.
I'm also horrified by the fact that he said all these people were doing it and couldn't produce anybody that actually done it. Then he adds on it, he did it, which automatically means that he's a war criminal. If he says, which he believe he said, he did it too. We just don't do that. We're Americans, and not that we're trying to conceal things, but I certainly wouldn't come out and start talking about things that aren't even true. And I thought he'd be more accountable for it. I really did.
If he had actually seen these things, would he say that on television, risking the chance that somebody would say, why the hell didn't you stop it?
Yeah, when John Kerry talked about the atrocities, the war crimes, that was so contrary to the war that I knew. Example, in the air war in North Vietnam, if there were a SAM site, which was shooting us down, surface air missile sites, they're flat guns. Guess where most of them were? They were within 2 miles of a pagoda. We couldn't go within 2 miles of a pagoda. We had to fly on certain headings because so the bombs, if they hung on the airplane too long, and we gave them every advantage to shoot us down because of the many rules that McNamara, Johnson, the people had put on. We were not committing war crimes. We were fighting that war with one arm tied behind us.
It was understandable that people opposed the war. It was understandable that a lot of young people didn't want to participate in it. It was a long and ugly war, and it was run by politicians, and it wasn't permitted to be won by the military, and so consequently the country was dragged through an enormous 10, 12 years of heartache. But to have
former military people actually come up and testify against our activities in Vietnam, and to accuse us of being war criminals was devastating.
He was saying we had done these things, and he was saying things that he knew to be false and knew would harm us. That means he abandoned his comrades. He burned up his Brotherhood Band of Brothers membership card when he did that.
The wives of POWs are no less adamant in their convictions. Louise Harris waited 7 years for her husband to return from the war. Mary Jane McManus was married just 3 days before her husband Kevin left for Vietnam. It would be nearly 6 years before she saw him again.
I believed that Smitty believed in what he was doing, or he wouldn't have been doing it. And I knew him to be a man of conscience. And I knew a lot of the fellows who were over there with him. As a matter of fact, so many of our squadron were over there in Hanoi, including Robbie Reisner, who was his squadron commander. And I knew the quality of these men. And I knew what they were saying was not true. And it was terribly upsetting to me that nobody covered anything except that kind of wrong thinking. As if Americans would truly go into countries and rape the women and kill the babies and do horrible, unspeakable things to the people. We were there to help those people, and I believed that with every fiber of my being. And whether or not the exact conduct of the war went as we wanted it to, I knew in my heart that men like Smitty and most of the people that I knew would not do the kinds of things that John Kerry was saying were being done. I didn't believe it.
I knew he was getting publicity, but I didn't believe that the American people were going to fall for what he was saying. They couldn't. They had sons, brothers, husbands over there fighting. They were war criminals coming back? They weren't. They were good men who, because of Kerry's testimony later, came back spat upon. They couldn't even wear their uniforms in the streets. I'm not going to say all the wives were thinking, but a vast majority of them, that Kerry was obviously, as my husband says, ruining the reputations of those who had already died, ruining the reputations of those who were still serving, of whom my brother was part, and, worst of all, killing any chances for our husbands to get home from Vietnam.
And that, perhaps more than any other issue, still haunts and angers many of these men and their families. Were John Kerry and his fellow anti-war activists responsible for lengthening their imprisonment, and in doing so, causing the deaths of men who might otherwise have survived? Their answers are unequivocal and chilling.
They unquestionably lengthened by untold number of months, maybe years, the amount of time that we were required to spend there. And had anybody acted upon their recommendations to the extent that they requested and basically capitulated and withdrawn our troops from Vietnam, we would have been committed to a death in North Vietnam, either over a long period of time for old age or immediately when the Vietnamese found us no longer useful.
Without question, we were held captives longer because of the anti-war people, from the Kerrys to the names of Fonda and Hayden, the ones we knew over there, that they encouraged the enemy to hang on.
It took the anti-war movement to help them win what they had to win. So those people that participated in that anti-war movement, they delayed the war, they caused additional American casualties, and as an incidental, oh, by the way, they kept me in jail longer, none of which I appreciate.
We stayed 2 more years because of him. John Kerry, Jane Fonda, and all that crowd, the anti-war movement, I figure they owe us 2 years.
I'm convinced that Kerry's and his fellow anti-war people caused the war to be extended for at least 2 more years. Throwing medals over the wall, speaking out against our country in time of war when he knows it's going to extend the war, it's going to delay, it's going to complicate things. And it's probably hurt a lot of people, a lot of prisoners, like I say. The man I dedicate my book to, I'm convinced, had the war been over 6 months earlier, he'd have been home alive today. but he's not.
Former Senator Bob Dole, a decorated war veteran himself, recently called on Senator Kerry to apologize to all Vietnam veterans for his actions in 1971. Will an apology heal the wounds Senator Kerry has reopened?
I would like to see John Kerry say, I was wrong. We did not, as policy, commit atrocities, committed barbarities over there, as he described. That just isn't so. And if he were to admit that he did that just for political gain or to get attention or to make a point and exaggerate it, I'd have a lot more respect for him.
What Senator Kerry did is irreparable. You can't repair that kind of damage. You can't get up and tell a bold-faced lie. And that's when he said we were rapists, we were murderers, we were pillagers, et cetera, et cetera. That was a bold-faced lie. There is nothing you can do. You cannot apologize for that. You can't say what I really meant was this. There's nothing that you can do. It's irreparable.
Frankly, an apology is not going to do anything for me now, because he doesn't owe the apology to me. He owes it to everyone who served in Vietnam, and for that matter, everyone who's ever served in the armed forces, peacetime or wartime, from the beginning of the country, since he turned his back on all of us.
When a war ends, those who fought it can expect to hear the praise of a grateful nation, honored for their sacrifice, remembered for their valor. But those returning from Vietnam experienced none of that. Instead, they were vilified, condemned, made to feel unclean, called sick, and even spat upon. For men like Colonel Bud Day, who spent 67 months as a prisoner of war and survived to become one of the most decorated veterans of the last century, including the nation's highest award for valor, the Medal of Honor. For distinguished veterans like Colonel Day, the damage done to those who served in Vietnam can never be reconciled.
I was also outraged to learn that my fellow soldiers and Marines who had come back had gone through some of those reception areas and been spit on, and that they had told them, don't wear your uniform on the airplane, don't subject yourself to all this abuse. All of those people had honorable service, and to have been mistreated the way they were when they came back from a war after having done their very best out in those steamy jungles of Vietnam was truly an outrageous thing. And right to this day, 2004, we still have not recovered our good name. The thing about the Kerry comments back in 1971 was that they were so sensational, they were so outrageous, that they were precisely the kind of thing that a propaganda expert and the news media were looking for. We went to that war with good intentions. We fought it under honorable conditions. We fought it under Geneva Conventions. And he has blackened the entire history, not just that day, not just for a few months, not for just a year, but now we're looking at 3 decades. He has destroyed the good name of all Vietnam veterans. This man committed an act of treason. He lied. He besmirched our name. He did it for his own self-interest. And now he wants us to forget. I can never forget.
The Vietnam War is not an experience most Americans would choose to relive. Those who fought it and those who fled it would both prefer to consign its painful memory to history and move on. But Senator John Kerry won't let us. By making his actions during and after the war the cornerstone of his political career, he forces us to feel again old agonies and regurgitate old doubts. And because of that, the long road back from the hell of Vietnam has grown even longer. And those of us who were there seem condemned to the damnation he and others have wrested upon us. Perhaps it will take a political debate in an election year to finally cleanse away the persistent stain of that war and drive off the demons that haunt our culture. Perhaps films like Apocalypse Now, which reflect John Kerry's view of the murderous American, will no longer be made because the dishonesty of it has been exposed. Perhaps, and this is a big perhaps, The media will own up to its complicity in allowing the Kerry testimony to remain relatively unchallenged and give the voices you have heard tonight a hearing throughout the land. Our American prisoners of war in Vietnam feel betrayed and unjustly accused, as do untold thousands of Vietnam veterans who served honorably and well. They believe too much has been made about the hand that helped a soldier back onto a boat, and too little written about how one man drowned the hopes of thousands, dishonored their sacrifice, and robbed them of their heritage, their place in history. They don't want a belated apology. They want John Kerry to be finally accountable for the disgrace, the harm he inflicted on an entire generation of good soldiers. Simply put, they want the truth, not parades or hero worship, just the plain truth, and their dignity and honor restored. I'm Carlton Sherwood. I know a lot about Vietnam and the men who fought and bled there. They didn't throw away their decorations or their honor. Perhaps the man who did will come forward and set the record straight. Good night and Godspeed.